Thank you very much, Lotta, and good morning, everyone. Hey, it's very nice to be here and to be able to tell you a bit about what we are thinking about and doing in Brussels, and also have the opportunity to discuss with you a bit about it. I will start, as Lotta said, to tell you a bit first about the EU Forest Strategy for 2030, which was adopted by the Commission, I think it's now 1.5, 2 years ago, and then focus in particular on the voluntary guidelines on closer to nature forest management, which we will publish in a couple of weeks, hopefully, and which I think is the most relevant of what we're doing under this strategy for the discussions here today. Okay, just to present you in a nutshell, the EU Forestry for 2030. You could frame the overall objective of this strategy to ensure in Europe bigger, better and stronger forests for our future. So in other words, forests that will be resilient and healthy enough also in the face of climate change, and be able to serve all the different functions and needs that we have as a society from them. And it's an integrated strategy, so it brings together different pillars. The first one is a focus on economic and social considerations, and the second one is focusing on environmental considerations. And then it sets out a couple of actions under what we would call critical enablers to make this happen, which is make sure we have a good evidence base, that we have a forward-looking, targeted research and innovation agenda, that we also have an inclusive and coherent governance setup, as well as making sure that the actions that we're doing are effectively implemented and enforced. Under this strategy, there is, and the different pillars I just showed you, there's many different actions. And I think the most important ones to mention here maybe is that we have an upcoming initiative for a legal act on forest monitoring and planning, which we will present in summer this year. And then we have set out, or are in the process of setting out, a set of voluntary guidelines to strengthen sustainable forest management. 2 of them have been already published in March. The first one on biodiversity-friendly afforestation, reforestation, and tree planting, and the second one on defining, mapping, monitoring, and strictly protecting EU primary and old-growth forest. And the third one, as I said, hopefully to be published in a couple of weeks, on closer to nature forest management. And this goes hand in hand with another guidance document on payment for ecosystem services, which we will also publish in a couple of weeks. And then as a second deliverable on closer to nature forest management, once the guidelines have been published, we will actually start working on a voluntary certification scheme for closer to nature forest management as a further incentive. Okay, so let's move and zoom in a bit more on the voluntary guidelines. Here, a short overview on what you will find in these guidelines. The first one is a sort of introductory part, setting out the rationale, why we are doing these guidelines, and then presenting a scope and principles for what we think how you could maybe frame closer to nature forest management, as well as then presenting a set of measures in a toolbox that you could take if you want to move closer to nature in your forest management, as well as a set of, again, critical enablers that will help you to do this. And then also knowing that the forests are so different in Europe, a set of case studies from different regions, including one on the boreal region, as well as a couple of examples on good practice from forests where closer to nature has been applied already since some time. And these guidelines have been or are prepared in close collaboration with the different member states representatives, as well as stakeholders from the forest sector, from forest owners, from Sami peoples, as well as also non-governmental organization. And we took a lot of time because it's been a very dynamic process. So we've been working on this now almost 2 years, and really discussing in depth and in detail with many, many people on what this could actually entail. Okay. Maybe just a bit of the rationale behind why we're doing this. This is where we stand on forests in Europe today. I think this might, to a certain extent, sound familiar also to the situation here in Sweden. Of course, land cover is more. You're one of the most forested countries in Europe. But I think when it comes, for example, to ownership, this might be also a similar case here in Sweden, as well as in terms of the use of forest for wood supply. I think there's more remaining primary old growth. But for example, when it comes to the structure of the forests, I think it's a similar situation here, that it's a rather low diversity and most of it is even aged managed. And sadly, across Europe, the overall conservation status, when we look at least at the Natura 2000 habitats, this is where we have the data on the EU level, we see that the overall conservation status is rather low. And why is the conservation status low? Here's an overview a bit about what are different pressures on forest biodiversity in the EU. And here you can see, for example, the removal of deadwood, clear cutting, removal of all trees, removal of old trees, a whole set of factors that are linked to the way forests are managed in many, many cases. So that was one of the reasons, the current forest management, that we thought, okay, something has to happen. Another reason is, if we look into the future, is climate change. The relationship between climate change and forests is manifold, you can say. One is, of course, the important role they play for carbon storage, but another one is how climate change will actually affect the vegetation types in Europe. And here you can see that this is the current status, and then you can see that up here in the boreal region, there is a prediction that this will actually turn from rather hemiboreal mixed forests into broadleafed forests more and more. But of course, this is a prediction, and there's other predictions out there as well. I think the only thing that is clear for sure is that the vegetation types will change with time. At the same time, we see that the demands and expectations from forests and societies in Europe are changing. They're increasing, in particular for biomass in the last couple of years, as well as also diversifying. And here's some of the most common multifunctions of forests. And for example, we can see that the recreational value has been increasing, notably also through the lockdown in many countries, as well as what is emerging as a stronger topic now is also the role of forests in the water cycle. So how do we bring all of this together? We know conservation status and health status is a mixed picture in Europe, as well as increasing pressure with climate change, increasing uncertainty, as well as increasing and diversifying demand. And there we think that closer to nature can be one of the answers in making sure that forests can deliver on all these different uses and interests, as well as also making sure they're strong enough, they're healthy and resilient enough to do this also in a changing climate. Then, briefly again, the policy context. From this background in the EU biodiversity strategy, it's already foreseen basically what I just said, that to ensure that we have the forests that we will need, closer to nature as one as the possibilities, as well as then in the forest strategy itself, committing the Commission to actually develop these guidelines, as well as also a definition, with already providing a basic definition as closer to nature is a set of multiple practices to ensure multifunctional forests by combining biodiversity and increased carbon absorption with timber-related revenues. And then based on this, like I said, through a very long and collaborative process, we framed the scope of objectives. So the first one is that these guidelines are targeted for forests that are managed and commercially used, while at the same time there might also be some benefits for protected areas, but it's not the main focus of the guidelines, as well as they're addressed to basically the practitioners who are responsible for the management of the forests. And they will promote biodiversity-friendly and adaptive forest management, and hopefully provide guidance to those that are responsible for this in implementing this over time. Then, as I said, we have tried to come forward with a sort of a definition, but it's difficult to put this into one sentence to say closer to nature is this and that, considering that there is a diversity of perspectives as well as local forest management context. So what we did is rather to put down a set of basic considerations and objectives, which you can see here. So it's based on ecosystem dynamics. It's safeguarding ecosystem functioning resilience. It brings together different pillars, not only environment, but also technical, economic, and social considerations. And it looks at forests as an ecosystem. It does not look at it only for timber production, but it really says forests are an ecosystems which have to be managed accordingly. And we come to that more. Based on this, it also promotes natural and complex forest ecosystem dynamics. Then there is a set of general principles which we base to a large extent on the report which was just shown. I mean, I saw the picture, I didn't understand what was said. My Swedish is rather non-existent. But it's the Larsen report on closer to nature forest management he's been doing with a set of scientific colleagues for the European Forest Institute. And based on this, we have this set of general principles for what closer to nature could entail. So it's learning from and permitting natural processes to develop, maintain a complex structure in your forest and forest patterns. It integrates the forest functions at different spatial scale, from the individual tree over the stand level to the landscape considerations. And it uses a variety of silvicultural systems based on natural disturbance patterns in the region. And timber harvesting should be rather low impact, with equal attention to what you take from the forest as well as to what you actually leave in your forest. Then, two main objectives based on this. One is to enhance structure complexity in species composition, as well as also in your vertical structure and also your age structure that you have in the forest, as well as also rely increasingly on natural forest dynamics, which helps once again to look more on forests as an ecosystem and move closer to nature, but also, for example, reduces investment costs while, for example, planting in the long term if you are more on natural regeneration. And your interventions should really aim at orientating these natural dynamics in line with your objectives and the natural range and distribution of existing and potential species of the site that you are working in. Then, based on this, we've put together a set of measures that one can do. There's no prescription or recommendation on how you combine this. We think ideally these should be used together, but again, this is how this is prioritized and how this is applied depends on the respective context and the respective objectives in the forest. We're just setting out, these are the things you can do. I was not given the time to talk about all of them, but I think it's good maybe to look at 3 of them, and then of course we can also discuss the other ones as well if there's questions or comments. First one, to promote natural tree regeneration as much as possible. Why? Because it increases genetic diversity and therefore helps to play with different options also in a changing climate. Which then strengthens the adaptive resilience to climate change, as well as also promoting the structural complexity in your forests, while at the same time we know and we are aware that there is a situation where artificial regeneration cannot be avoided, maybe as an interim sole measure or in combination with natural tree regeneration. And that's, for example, if you don't have suitable seed trees, or there's a high browsing pressure from deer, for example, or competitive ground vegetation, which does not facilitate certain species, tree species, to start by themselves. As well as also what we call assisted migration, which basically refers to the shift in vegetation through climate change, which might, in some cases, or should be facilitated by anticipating species of local provenance to move up to then also start planting these. And also, of course, where you have restoration needs, for example, of food habitats, artificial regeneration might also be needed. However, what should always be considered in our view is to see really to address the reasons why natural regeneration is not possible, and also then act accordingly. Like, for example, if there's also an issue with the soil health, then maybe one should also look at how to address and improve the health in the soil to facilitate natural regeneration over time. Then dead wood. There's no waste in the forest. It has an important role for biodiversity. I think up to 40% of all species that you can find in the forest in one point in their life will depend on dead wood, but also on different types of dead wood. So lying dead wood, standing dead wood, small debris, bigger logs. So it's important to, in order for biodiversity in particular, to improve the volume, type, and stage of decay of dead wood in a forest. And here you can, for example, see an overview that was done in the Natura 2000 context in terms of what are existing dead wood levels and what is the actual dead wood needs of certain species. I have to say this is a couple of years old, so the average is in many of these countries or sites higher by now, but it gives you an idea of which is actually the room of maneuver in which you're operating when it comes to biodiversity. And then, of course, in particular in Southern Europe, a big topic these days is how to balance dead wood needs for biodiversity with fire prevention measures. Setting areas aside, I know is I think also in Sweden something very common. It's not necessarily a measure of closer to nature as such in our perspective, but can be an important accompanying measure. Because it's a good tool for integrating biodiversity conservation into forest management. However, here it's important to see and to choose the size and the location of the sites in line with the biodiversity needs that you're looking at. So, and I just give the example here of the lesser-spotted woodpecker, that if you want to do good for this little fellow, then it's important to realize or to recognize that it requires a minimum of 40 hectares of forest dominated by deciduous trees, which should be not more fragmented of maximum over an area of 200 hectares. So, of course, these are all average estimates, but it gives just an illustrative idea of how to go about setting areas aside. Then, as I said, moving from a traditional forest management system into closer to nature will come with some challenges. And based on this, we've put together a set of enablers on how this can be helped and facilitated. Again, no time to look at all of them, but to give a couple of examples. The first one is training and skills. It's important that you know what you're doing, or you have someone you can rely on and ask in terms of what should I do. And there we've, on an EU level, so one thing is that the guidelines bring this to the attention, that it's important in countries on the respective levels to make sure that there is training possibilities. And of course, we also hope that the guidelines will be of use. As well as also on the EU level, we are also, as part of the forest strategy, we are motivating, for example, a European Pact for Skills, which facilitates the establishment of a network for upskilling and reskilling. We see this as an opportunity, for example, to bring together training operators from different countries in Europe, because some countries in Europe have a long time experience with close to nature management, or for some others it's a rather new situation. And then there's also financial funding in terms of setting up educational programs. And we also support of existing networks like Integrate or ProSilva, which again have a lot of experience with closer to nature. And I think I'm speaking too long, so I'm getting to an end. Just again, economic viability I think is important. And here we know that closer to nature from practical examples can be more profitable in a forest they compare it to intensive management. However, there might be a transition period when moving from a clustering rotational system into closer to nature, where income loss could be an issue. And there we, for example, think it's important also to look at payment for ecosystem services and also provide some guidance on existing funding schemes on an EU level that can be used to compensate during this transition period for certain measures. Okay, then just again to illustrate that we also look at different regions in the guidelines, and as I said, there is also an example coming forward for the Boreal region, which we've been elaborating with the colleagues in Sweden and Finland that are involved in this process. And I think I leave it for here. Just to say again, the guidelines will be published in a couple of weeks, hopefully first in English and then step by step in all European languages to make sure that they reach as much people as possible also in the different countries. Thank you.